Good day, everybody. This is Trey Johnson with Zap. We're going to give it just another minute for the attendees to make their way in, and then we'll get started. Thanks. Okay, thank you, everybody. Once again, this is Trey Johnson with Zap. I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar on connecting Power BI and Dynamics 365 the right way. Joining me today is Rich Ecker, and he'll come online in just a little bit when we kind of offer a bit of a spotlight around the solution that we're ultimately talking to today. But before we get started, really wanted to just echo out to everybody that we certainly miss seeing you. We've had the great fortune over the last 12 months to spend opportunities at Power Platform World Tour events, at the User Group Summit in North America, the equivalent event in Europe, and obviously, some other venues as well. And as so many of those t-shirts say, we really love it when you talk data to us. So we're hoping that all of you are here and excited to talk a little bit about data, specifically as it relates to D365 and the Power Platform. And as a result, what we'd like to do today is cover off a handful of things from an agenda standpoint. First off, we would very much like to talk just a little bit about our views on the needs continuum for analytics around Dynamics 365, knowing that all of you are in kind of different places with your journey of using Power BI or using other tools to access D365. We'll have a bit of a conversation there. Then we're really excited to just kind of walk through the different options that exist for connecting Power BI to D365 in your data. Ultimately, we want to help you understand the methods around choosing the right approach for your particular data situation, and then ultimately, convey some thoughts around using tools to connect to Power BI for not only the D365 apps, but also other sources of data. And as I mentioned, Rich will come along towards the end and talk a little bit about Zap Data Hub from a software spotlight, and certainly we'll do some Q&A. For those of you not familiar with the GoToWebinar user interface, there is a questions panel. We would highly encourage that you enter your questions there. We'll likely take a lot of those questions towards the end, but feel free to pump those questions in at any point, because the likelihood of us, remembering exactly what was said where is only better if you put in the questions. So, for those of you that are not familiar with Zap as an organization, we actually got our start in 2001. We're geographically placed in a number of places around the world, as are many of you that are on this call, which is just simply fantastic. We have really shown ourselves to be focused on not only the analytics side of things, but more importantly, the data side as well. And that's particularly important given that we can source data from not only Dynamics 365, other ERPs, including legacy Dynamics applications, a multitude of CRMs, and really all types of additional data. With customers sitting in, some of which are on this call, sitting in over 45 countries, we really have a breadth of experience working with all different types of organizations. And we really our global operations are bolstered by a lot of local relationships, whether that be our own local staff or our local partner network. And so we're really keen to, certainly be available to those of you that have additional ongoing interest about what it is that we offer. And so before we get into this particular discussion about the needs continuum, I did actually want to just offer up one poll real quickly. And so um, let me go ahead and launch this poll, and it's a good way for all of you to interact. And so the poll is being distributed now. You'll see it in just a moment. If you would go through and kind of answer the question of when it comes to analytics. Sorry, it's trying to read it here. When it comes to analytics on D365, what are some of the things that you consider? So appreciate that many of you are actually replying to this poll at the moment, which is really good. We'll give it just another moment. Feel free to check those boxes. We'll count it down from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great. That's really good feedback. I don't know that the poll is sharing. Let me do share real quick. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see the poll results. Obviously, there was a lot of good responses, in the areas of that you have a lot of data, that you want an easier option, and certainly that you have a lot of users that want to see the results. So very good there. So go ahead and hide the poll, and that should bring us back into our slides. And so again, talking to the needs continuum, because I think a lot of you just shared some really good insights. What our view around the needs continuum is for the D365 users is people are in the mode of on the leftmost axis of taking on business decisions from a tactical to a strategic perspective. And a lot of organizations very much start tactically, wanting system reports and things of that nature. And additionally, they're really focused on a simple set of business processes in the lower corner, if you will. As we progress, people are focused on a broader range of data. They're looking to make more strategic decisions. And so there's analytics and there's different, ways of looking at that information that kind of maps into it. So to simply kind of talk to and walk through this, the basic reports that you get out of the current environment as system reports, things of that nature, certainly give a little bit of insight. Maybe they help with processes that are occurring within the ERP, such as, order processing, things of that nature, but very much kind of focused, in the moment. As we kind of progress, users are then kind of, given the opportunity to not only use those system reports, but maybe these are reports that allow for an element of filtering criteria, maybe take you beyond the hundreds of rows or multiple pages within the report and allow you to focus in on, a core set of results. As we continue along that process, what we really discover is that people kind of run out of runway, if you will, to understand what's going on, in the system simply from a report. And so having that ability to navigate to the underlying details is important, because a lot of times when the information is presented and starts to get presented in a more aggregated way, people are wanting to understand what's happening in the underlying process. They're trying to, for lack of a better way to put it, look for that needle in the haystack and understand exactly kind of what is going on. The navigations back to the detail are certainly an essential element. And that's one of the things that whatever data store you're using really needs to support you being able to go from relatively high levels of information down to relatively low information levels. And at those lower information levels, it might just simply be that it gives you enough information that you can link back into the D365 user interface. So for example, an order number or an individual customer or things of that nature will allow you to open those corresponding screens within the application and just have that richer experience, if you will. In addition, we certainly feel like that once users and decision makers are crossing over from maybe a lot of the tactical views into the more strategic realm, that they really need a set of tools that support them. And so a lot of times when you look at the Power BI artifacts that have come with the D365 applications or what people have built and shown in user groups and the like, a lot of these visual analytical elements really lend to the start of those strategic decision-making processes. Certainly there's a capability to continue to be tactical in some regard, but you start to become a lot more strategic. And that process just simply continues as people move more into end user configured analytics. People have used the term self-service, but really in our experience, there's a set of people that are really authoring analytics for a larger group. That larger group should have the ability to kind of do some changes in configuration and manipulation. And it's these, insights that are driven in a very specific way for the individual's role that allows them to start looking across business processes, looking across modules, and even potentially across D365 applications. So I know some of you are sitting there that probably have multiple investments around D365. Maybe it's not only D365 finance, but you might have the supply chain and sales or some other CE element. Those elements can certainly be blended together based on the things that we're going to talk about today. And as we do start to blend those things together, what that then allows for is the opportunity for us to truly monitor the business processes more so in an end-to-end type of fashion. So with all of that said, I think that there's probably a number of you that are in the audience that have seen your business get a little bit stuck on some of the tactical stuff. Too many reports, not enough information. Give me a spreadsheet, and that's all that I need. Those are probably a lot of the comments that we all tend to hear a bit directly from the end consumers. A lot of times, the tactical issues that you see on the screen here are driven by the fact that people have kind of inconsistent ways that they pull the information out. And so that inconsistency just leads to scenarios where, hey, gross profit doesn't line up across these two reports, or gosh, that's a totally different definition than we use in the sales team, and so on and so forth. And it's really that inconsistency that creates that, unfortunately, that undercurrent of people not having the information they need or not having ultimately the trust in the information that they need. And so when we really talk to the overall needs continuum, we really see most of the organizations that we interact with are really pretty squarely at kind of the beginning of the process. And so if that's where you are, not a big deal. That's certainly a very common place to be. A lot of times, organizations just haven't really had the opportunity to fully explore Power BI as a tool set in a meaningful way. Maybe it's because there's a little bit of a lack of skills around that tool set. And certainly if that's the case, it's great that you guys are here. There are users that simply kind of bar the door to new technology and want you to really deliver all the information in Excel because that's what they're used to. To be perfectly honest, even before we get into the options themselves, there is a degree of technical complexity around some of them, and certainly that's an inhibitor. And not only is that an inhibitor in the case of end users like yourselves, but a lot of the partners that we now work with, they kind of stubbed their toe and scraped their elbows a little bit trying to do some of the more technical things previously. So, and then lastly, the business doesn't always have an appetite for waiting around for a long amount of time, to get to information. So that causes us to fall back into the patterns of stuff that we can reproduce. So if any of that resonates, good news is we have multiple options that we want to talk through with you today for connecting Power BI to your D365 data. And so we'll cover off from an option standpoint the different mechanisms with which data can be stored and extracted from D365. We'll talk a bit about modeling, within Power BI, as well as we'll talk about, our own technology, which is called Zap Data Hub, as part of the conversation. So before we jump straight into those topics, it's probably worth level setting on just a little bit of the terminology because uh, acronyms are great, but I think all of us that have been around Microsoft know there's a lot of acronyms, particularly in the D365 ecosystem. And so um, OData, if you've not ever heard of OData, it's just simply the technology that underpins connectivity to the D365 apps, and that's not something that we necessarily need to dwell on too much. But the entity store is probably something those of you that are sitting on what was D365 Finance and Ops, now is Finance and Supply Chain, are probably have heard about. The entity store is really effectively the data warehouse within F&O. It's an opportunity for those that administer F&O as an application to map elements into the entity store, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. What it ultimately does is provides a little bit of summary of the data. Some of you have possibly gone down the path of the BYOD or bring your own database. That is really another administratively enabled option to replicate some of the ERP data to an ancillary database. And in so doing, what that does is that provides, kind of a secondary copy of some of the data within the schema that consists of 1,700 plus tables underneath F&O. And then lastly, there's the CDS or the Common Data Service. That has been pretty common across D365 from a F&O or finance and supply chain, plus all of the kind of elements of the CRM umbrella. It's relatively new to the Business Central arena. That is a service that basically allows for you to, as a D365 customer with apps, publish the data onto that service and then correspondingly extract the data from it. And so when it comes to querying, we talked just a moment ago about the OData elements. If you've tried to connect to Business Central, on-prem or even really in the cloud, OData is really kind of the underpinning that is delivering this. And so some of the characteristics of OData, if you're really dealing with larger volumes of data, the cycle of querying and extracting and refreshing the data can be a bit long. So if you don't have an opportunity to do things incrementally, well, that just means that the refresh, possibly is not a great experience for a lot of you. It does require certain elements, on the Business Central side in terms of, the web service enablement, for the queries that you want to issue. And the bigger challenge is that as you go through this process, there are multiple, there's a multiplication kind of effect, if you will. So as the number of companies increase within Business Central, a lot of the things that you do get multiplied as well. And so that is one of the more challenging aspects. Is a lot of times when people go into this initially, maybe they only see the data for one company. In order to see the data for multiple companies, that means that you're adding essentially new queries that use a different company as the data source. Entity stores is another element that if you're familiar with, the former AX technology, there were some elements called OLAP cubes. Those are somewhat synonymous in that they behave kind of in the same way. Essentially what you have with the entity store is you have an aggregated representation of the data currently. There is some public preview sort of stuff that's coming along that allows for people to map the entity store data directly into data lakes, which is a little bit different. I think that does unlock a different level of detail, but in terms of what's commercially available right now, it's very much along the lines of what OLAP cubes were. Because of that, essentially what we're doing is we're using DirectQuery from Power BI embedded to go up against the entity store. Certainly these entities are very optimized for reporting. The challenge, if you're not familiar with Power BI embedded, it really just works within the framework, if you will, of an F&O deployment. And that means that from a development standpoint, you really need to recreate that environment in totality to support the embedded elements. What you also need to do is you need to be mindful of the fact that you are doing a bit more than is the traditional, kind of building Power BI resources when it comes to migrating this into a production environment. And so those are all things to be kind of managed and considered. The other element that I would say is possibly a challenge, especially if your organization is looking beyond simply your finance and supply chain footprint, is that there's not a real opportunity to really embrace other data unless you bring that other data into the F&O schema and then publish that schema element to the entity store itself. So one of the next elements is the CDS, or the Common Data Service. And as we mentioned, the Common Data Service really facilitates the publishing of data and integrating with the CDS for data flowing back and forth within your app. There are multiple steps. We tried to kind of portray them a little bit on the screen to the right side of the screen. The numbers are 1, 2, 3, and N. And the reason for that is because literally for every entity, you do have to go through a process of doing these types of configurations. And so the Common Data Service is a well thought through model from a common data standpoint. But there's quite a bit of things that you need to do administratively to kind of turn that on and make it happen. Once you're in Power BI and you've done that configuration, the experience is really very good because you're able to connect to the Common Data Service. You're able to obviously start to build the reports. The only downside, if you're staying within just a kind of a single workbook orientation, is that if you look to build additional analytics that are unrelated, then a lot of times people go off and start the same process over with an additional Power BI workbook. So it is possible to customize the Common Data Service. That's probably a little bit beyond the scope of this conversation, but it's certainly something that we would welcome the chance to help people understand. One of the things that I think is probably important to understand is where entity stores and even BYOD to an extent, the costs are all incredibly well known. There's a little bit of a variable cost associated with the Common Data Service, and so there we can give you the URL that takes you directly to the pricing, but I think in the current form, it's somewhere between $10 and $40 per user per month to use the Common Data Service. And then lastly, there's BYOD, and so BYOD, for people that have kind of lived traditionally in a database world and are familiar with databases, the great news is we can use Power BI modeling and import from BYOD. We can also use DirectQuery to go up against that SQL store. If you are going to use BYOD, you do have to have an Azure subscription. You do have to provision the Azure SQL resource. You do have to configure the entity export, which can be a little bit challenging because, again, remember that especially from an F&O perspective, there's 1,700 plus entities, within that schema. So there is a little bit of a longer list of some things that need to be done to make this a bit more user-friendly, including the mapping of essentially what is metadata or the labels that users would have seen in the application. A lot of that needs to be, kind of manually done. And then again, this is something that does require, a degree of repetition across, multiple Power BI users. And so all of those things being said, especially the elements about the repetition across Power BI users, lead to kind of the conversation around the potential of modeling D365 data separately in Power BI. And so a lot of you, and I don't want to make too many assumptions here, but I would say that a lot of you have more than likely done the scenario of where you got somewhat directly connected to D365, either Business Central or F&O or Sales, and we're able to kind of build some reports. Microsoft calls it the 5 minutes to wow with Power BI, and certainly there is that ability to get there in 5 minutes. What is kind of the downside is, that you may discover at some point thereafter that it's a little bit cumbersome in terms of the way that you're doing things, or doesn't scale well, or it doesn't support, customizations or changes that you might choose to make. That's where modeling tends to come into play, whether it's here within Power BI or some of the other things we'll describe in just a moment. And what the modeling within Power BI simply allows you to do is really separate the preparation and the structuring of the data from the building of reports, but it's in an insulated way, so that if something changes on the D365 side, you're coming back in and you're manipulating the Power BI data sets, you're manipulating the Power BI data flows. If you're familiar with Power BI, which I assume that some of you are, you would probably know the name Reza Rad. Reza has got several great resources on the website radicad.com, but you'll notice his quote on the bottom of the screen here. For real Power BI being done, against, enterprise applications like D365, a lot of the effort goes into data preparation. And so I won't, totally paraphrase his words here, but clearly, if you're going to model within Power BI, there is a level of investment that needs to incur to ensure that, you've not duplicated things like the data prep across multiple reports, that you've kind of created the scenario where data sets can be shared, and that you can support, at least to a greater degree, multiple sources of data. It's not particularly easy, and it does require a different set of skills. So you have to be understanding of additional skill sets like Power Query, which is just a different language, if you will, and that is something that needs to obviously be part of it. So delving a little bit deeper, modeling for D365 data separately within Power BI is certainly relevant for connecting to OData as a source, for connecting to the Common Data Service, and connecting to BYOD. You notice Entity Store is not mentioned because, again, that goes back to Power BI Embedded only works with the Entity Store. And frankly, the Entity Store, kind of in a very simple way, serves as a means of modeling the Dynamics F&O data. So within the modeling that you do within Power BI separately, you can create some optimizations, certainly drive towards, better opportunity for reporting and analysis. It does require more work, and honestly, some of you may run into some practical limits relatively quickly, because the Power BI licensing, obviously there's some data limitations, and I won't go into those or put them on the recording because they're apt to change, but suffice it to say, if you're not at least the pro level of licensing, you're not even really in a position where you can kind of share the information across. So there's a lot of public domain articles. I would certainly start with radicad.com because there's just some really good information there on the separating, the model from the actual reporting that you do within Power BI, but it's something that you certainly want to consider. Lastly, just to talk quickly about it, there's an opportunity to really bring D365 into a data warehouse for Power BI. And when we do that, there's just some natural benefits that come as a result of that. So when we decide to build a data warehouse for Power BI, a lot of times it's because there are multiple sources of other data that doesn't fit really well into the Common Data Service semantic, or align, perfectly well with the BYOD type of thing. Those certainly are pretty obvious. It does also give us the opportunity, when we're working within a separate data warehouse, that we can really bring across, more data from the D365 applications. So rather than be stuck at an aggregated level with the Entity Store, we can actually bring across a lot of detail, and that detail then obviously supports some things on that needs continuum where we're talking about. it does remove a lot of the things that one would typically consider as administrative work or development type work within the D365 applications to extend the common data service or map elements into BYOD or the entity store. And it certainly gives us a lot more control over the way that we make data available and how we refresh the information, even versus some things that are enabled with the Power BI modeling. And so that is something that's really kind of where Zap is very focused. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But you know, one of the key things that I think is, as we talk about this and as we go into the spotlight, what you'll see is not only are we automating the data warehouse, but there are some out-of-the-box Power BI analytics that are out there and available. And so just to very quickly, you know, kind of portray what Zap Data Hub does, and probably the most simple graphic that we could use. We've got it right here on the screen. Not only are we able to talk to D365, not only are we able to talk to Azure-based data, but we're also able to talk to a lot of other line of business applications that might be on Microsoft SQL Server, they might be on other, you know, on-premise relational database platforms, or it might be other cloud-based applications. All of those are brought across individually by Zap Data Hub into a single data store that then is really optimized for the purpose of using Power BI directly against it. And so that is one of the probably the key things that we want to, you know, talk about from a choosing the right approach standpoint. Certainly there are different things that we can cover off, but again, I've got one more poll that I want to do just real quickly if I can. So let's go ahead and launch that real quick. And in this particular poll, it's just what data do you want in your final analytics? And so if you've got the opportunity to go ahead and respond, we'll give this just like 30 seconds just to see what folks have to say. I really appreciate that folks are actively voting. You know, this is certainly kind of coming down pretty heavily weighted around D365 as one would expect. We'll give it just another moment. We'll count it down from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great. Thank you very much for your responses. And so this is essentially, you know, kind of how as a group you all voted. So no big surprises. The D365 elements are certainly very important. But there are other sources of data, SQL servers particularly, that folks are looking to include. So thank you very much for that. What we'll do is, again, just talk about, you know, real briefly some of the considerations. And so organization capabilities, you know your organization really well. You're on this call, you might be an army of one, or you might be part of a larger group that's focused on Power BI. Depending on where you and your team skill sets lie, the different approaches that we've described, you know, kind of might map in really well. Ancillary data needs, you know, we just kind of posted that poll around the other data. For those of you that are particularly looking to use D365, but know as soon as you start turning on analytics that people are going to ask about that other database or that other application, those sort of things, that's something to equally bear in mind. The technical sophistication, you know, what really that means is, does the technical sophistication around, you know, the changes that occur in the application introduce additional costs? Does it introduce risks? And then lastly, kind of what's the perceived time to value? I don't know about your individual organizations, but so many of the organizations we work with today, particularly in the COVID-19 times, you know, people are wanting to make sure that anything that they invest in, even if it's just simply paying you to do your job, has some return. And so it's really how long does it take to ultimately kind of get to that point of return. So just a couple more slides in terms of choosing the right approach. This is probably something that is probably better viewed and digested on the recording. There are great options. You know, the entity store underneath AX, you know, is certainly, or sorry, underneath F&O is certainly going to give you some good options for having an integrated experience for your F&O users, without a doubt. Beyond that, you really probably are needing to look at, things like BOIOD or even the ZAP solution, and Rich will drill into that in just a moment. There are, certainly some differences and some caveats. The one thing I'd probably point out too is that the things that you might do within the D365 environment, the administratively heavy elements or developer heavy elements, really require a Visual Studio like design and customization, where that's not really so much the approach with ZAP, and hopefully we can show you just a bit of that in a moment. The incremental loading is really important. If you don't know what incremental loading is, just know that if you've been running F&O for some period of time, or you've been running your ERP for some period of time, you've accumulated a lot of transactions. If you don't have that ability to incrementally extract that data, then it is going to be fairly costly to move that data across the wire to other sources of information as well. So with that, I think we'll probably move pretty quickly because I realize we've got a really good software spotlight that we want to do here. In terms of the embedded or the out of the box as a starting point, the embedded Power BI analytics, if your users haven't had a chance to experience them, it might be a really good place to start. We do have some organizations that have said it wasn't something they could really turn on because of the way that they had structured F&O. But if you do have the ability to turn it on, I would encourage you to do so. We do have some analytics that are out on AppSource that equally can kind of give you that early starting point. And what's really important about giving people something that's out of the box or embedded is it really allows for you as the person that's trying to solve for the needs of the organization, some analytical direction, meaning what is it that they're wanting to see? What is it that's important to them? Because in that way, if you do explore modeling of the data in Power BI or even in a separate tool set like Zap Data Hub, you're going to be on a much better path for doing that. We certainly, if we think back to the needs continuum, at some point other data comes into play. Now there are a lot of operational roles that are along that continuum that if they're in purchasing or they're in finance or accounts receivable and AR, they might be able to kind of focus in on a core set of data that originates only in one application. However, in some of the more sophisticated roles, and certainly in your leadership roles, people are going to want to be able to look from what is an ERP-based data set against a CRM-based data set against other data sets that are just naturally part of the line of business, so that they can really understand what is going on across the organization. And really in our view, because of the fact that we have enabled so many organizations to blend D365 data with other data, it really solves for the scenario where people naturally want to ask some additional questions, interact with the information, get some additional answers. That really drives a different level of adoption. So if you've struggled with Power BI adoption, one of the things that you might consider is, are you actually giving them all of the data that they need so that they can ask questions and get answers in a really valuable way? And so lastly, if Power BI is approachable, what that really means is that, it's just a better opportunity for more Power BI. So as people interact with Power BI and they come to understand, the core analytics that you built, there will be demand for additional analytics. You need to really think about who is going to really solve for that additional ongoing demand. That ongoing demand might be something that you can actually push out into other departments in your organization, get other people as more lightweight Power BI type developers and those sorts of things. Much easier to do if you control the central source of the data versus relying on the individuals to kind of query even things mildly complex like the common data service and the like. So with that, we'll just conclude right here with a little bit of information about Zap and the things that we do. Rich is going to really reinforce a lot of this within the software spotlight. We're very focused on you bringing forward all of the information from your D365 and making available in the Power BI solution, starting with all of the elements of metadata, which is probably a little bit unique compared to the other alternatives that we described. The nice thing is you are not having to venture into Visual Studio or multiple admin UIs to drive the modeling and extraction of the data. You do have access to the entire schema, so that's certainly a little bit different than maybe some of the alternatives we're offering. And it's also a really cost-effective way of extracting the data, not only from D365, but from other sources as well. So if you are an organization that is really standardized on D365, but you have other sources of data, either by nature of you have subsidiaries that haven't been converted, or your business goes through some level of merger and acquisition, know that what we do within the Zap Data Hub product allows you to bring that additional data in. And we really encourage you to get your hands on our pre-built Power BI apps that are out on AppSource, because we really feel like that's a good way to minimally start the conversation with your organization about the things that they want to see. And so with that, I'll kind of just stop here. Rich, I know you're going to cover off in a software spotlight, talk a bit about the AppSource, Power BI analytics, show a bit about Data Hub, specifically around connecting to D365. So at this stage, I will just simply switch you over to presenter, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Trey. Yep.
There we go.
All right. Let me go ahead and I will start sharing my screen here. So Trey, if you can just confirm that you see my screen.
I can, Rich. Yep.
Okay, perfect. So a couple things that I just wanted to cover off during the software spotlight. I really want to showcase just how easy it is to connect to your ERP data in a meaningful way with Zap. So this is really beneficial if you don't have a data warehouse. You're not connecting to all the ERP data from F&O that you would like to. This is where Zap really helps you with that. So I want to cover off in terms of what does it take to connect to your F&O instance, and then once it's connected, what does that look like? So what is Zap also doing behind the scenes to make your reporting easier? So I want to cover that off. And then we'll jump over to Power BI. So we want to take a look at visually, how do you access this data in Power BI, and what does that data model look like? And then also we'll end off on the Power BI analytics that we have made available on AppSource. So let me go ahead and get started. So this screen that I'm on here is a screen that you access when you're ready to deploy a data model. So if you are trying to connect to D365 F&O with Zap, this is where you would start. So you come in, you see it's a web interface, and you can see that there's a variety of connections that we have. So not only are we supporting D365 F&O, but we have support for Business Central, D365 Sales, and then, as well as other ERPs. So if you ever have one of those merger or acquisition situations, you need to combine data from some of those ERP, from a non-Microsoft ERP, you see we have support for many of those as well as additional other data sources. But in this, I want to go ahead and I want to connect to our F&O. So I click on that, and you'll see that when I choose this option, I'm presented with a couple options here. If we go ahead and click on deploy on this top option, what this will do is this will not just deploy a connection to F&O, it's going to deploy a fully intuitive data model. So what that means is that we zero in on the tables that are relevant for reporting. I think Trey had mentioned that there's about 1,700 tables that's in F&O. We're going to zero in on just the tables that are relevant for reporting. And then we're going to relate all of that information together automatically. Additionally, we give context to the data. So instead of guessing what is a transaction type of 1, we actually give you that information. So again, when you're reporting this information in Power BI, you have all the tools and all the information you need. So I'm going to go ahead and click on deploy. And I'll just show you quickly at what it takes to build this data model. I'm not going to do it in this time. We just don't have enough time to do it. It takes generally about 15, 20 minutes to deploy a data model. But what I want to show is that it's just these steps here to deliver a fully automated data warehouse with D365 F&O data. So the first step here is entering in your connection information. So I already have a data model here that I've gone and done this with. And so to enter in that connection information, this is the information you put in here. And the next step would be just selecting what companies that you want to bring in. So it'll automatically detect all of the F&O companies, and then just clicking on Create Model. That's all it takes to generate a data model. And so once that's generated, you'll see that Zap is making you smart with what tables that it's bringing in. So again, what you'll see here is a list of all the tables in D365 F&O, and I could keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and there's a lot. But what Zap is doing is it's identifying the relevant tables for reporting. So anything in blue is what we're bringing in. And we're not bringing in these table names. We're actually translating these table names into a little bit more intuitive. Now, so like general journal entry here, we space it out. But some of these other kind of code and lookup tables, we actually give a little bit of context with, so it's easy for your reporting analysts to understand what they're reporting on. So again, our first step is let's identify all the key tables that we're bringing in. And once we do that, this is the administrative mode of that data model. And so again, we identified the key tables to bring in here. And once we bring in all that information, they show up as data pipelines. And as you can see, we have 244 pipelines. It's a lot different than 1,700. So rather than having to navigate that complex F&O database, Zap is doing that for you. And so what we're looking at here is all of these different data pipelines. Think of a data pipeline as just a vehicle to move data from F&O into a data warehouse. So if I look at, say, I had this customer transactions, and I already opened it, right? Which is just our accounts receivable, right? So if I open up this is saying that it's taking all the information from F&O to customer trends, but it's giving you context as well. So what that means is that we're giving information to that data. So as I had mentioned, in that transaction database, or in that customer transactions table, we have something called transaction type. We don't know what that is, right? It's just a number value. We're giving the context here. So instead of looking at 215, we actually say, hey, it's either a payment, a sales order, a project, or some other value. Additionally, we're layering in calculations with this data. And you can see that there's a pretty lengthy case statement here that this is all delivered to you out of the box to give you to just make you smarter with the data that you're getting from your ERP. We provide hundreds of additional report calculations, things like days sales outstanding. This is the number of payments that are late by a particular category. We have the number of invoices, et cetera. So what we're trying to do is just give relevant, meaningful information to your data. Going back to that data model, we also provide relationships. So what that means is that when you're bringing in your sales data and you're trying to understand what are all the different ways that you can report sales data by, this is delivered to you out of the box. So if I come in here and I start looking for, let's say I want to look at what relates to sales, I can see all these different things that relate to sales. All these relationships are built and detected automatically. So when you go and report that information in Power BI, it's merely just clicking on a checkbox to have sales be reported by any one of these entities.
Yeah, and Rich, I think that's probably one of the important elements is we are detecting the relationships automatically. So those of you that aren't, overly keen with trying to bring in dozens, if not hundreds of entities from F&O and try and relate them to one another, we're absolutely solving that issue for you.
Yeah, and this being our smart solution, these are vetted relationships. So we're only bringing in the relationships that make sense. We're not going to have, a sales type map to an inventory transaction. That doesn't make any sense. We're only bringing in just those meaningful relationships. Okay. Lastly, on this data model that I just want to talk about quickly is, so we showed that number one, it's identifying the relevant tables to be brought in. It's transforming those, and then it's also relating that data. But let's say that we have an additional data source that we want to bring in. We have data, say, in D365 sales that we want to bring in. So it's as easy as just clicking on a data source here. And I did this already here, but by clicking on that data source here, you can tell it, okay, we're bringing in, let's say, CRM data, and then it's just a matter of just selecting which tables that you want to bring in from that CRM system. Once you select those tables, those relationships get mapped into your data model. So as you're bringing in other data sets, such as, in this case, D365 sales, it could be SQL data, it could be Oracle data, it could be Excel files, it could be, project data, any one of those entities. It really is just as simple as coming into here, hitting an add data source, putting in that connection information, and selecting the elements that you want.
Rich, and I think that's probably an important element, for folks to understand is we do have a multitude of smart data sources. I kind of cheated and saw some of the questions coming in. I think somebody was asking even about AX for that matter. So if you do have, kind of a starting point with F&O or even a starting point with Business Central, and you have legacy AX or legacy NAV in your organization, those can be brought in as well. And as you were talking to, the CRM pieces, could be brought in additionally. Given the timing, do we want to shift gears a little bit and just kind of orient people to the Power BI and app source elements?
Yes, and that's what I'm getting to. The last thing I just want to touch on is the fact that this process of bringing in this data, setting up the pipelines and those relationships is literally only about 5 or 6 clicks to get there. And additionally, is once that is set up, all new data that goes into your ERP data will automatically come over into this, and that can be configured on whatever kind of schedule. So if you want it if you want certain data to be updated every 5 minutes, or you want all data to be brought in overnight, that can be set up right within here. So once you do this process and you set up this data model for D365 F&O, or you bring in an additional data source, what does that look like? So I'm going to switch gears here, and I'm going to jump over to our Power BI interface. And so what we're looking at here is on the right-hand side, this is that data model that Zap delivers. Everything's organized in buckets that make sense. If I'm looking at my OpenAR, here's all my OpenAR measures. If I'm looking at our sales measures, all my sales measures are right in here. And you can see that there's quite a bit of measures here. So I may not have any knowledge of D365 F&O, but I can report on it almost as an expert because Zap is enabling me to understand that data from D365 F&O through this catalog here. So again, if I'm looking at what's our sales, and you can see what I did is I just did our top customers based on sales amount. So I came in here and I just choose our sales amount, and then I scroll down and you can see all of our different dimensions that we're bringing in. So I just came in here, grabbed a customer, and now we have a very simple Power BI report that literally takes seconds to build once Zap is enabled. So this can really support a lot of extensive reporting capabilities from F&O. Now, additionally, if you don't want to build, say you don't know what you want to build and you want to have a good starting point, so Zap is going to help you with that as well. Is that right now within AppSource, we have quite a bit of dashboards as well. So if I go into our app source here, for example, I'm just going to bring up one example here, and I'm just looking. This is our D365 General Ledger Analytics. You can see it gives you a financial overview of your business. There's a P&L statement, balance sheet statement. You have expenses analysis as well. And I know we're running kind of close on time here, but one thing I just want to show is that we have these out of the box Power BI analytics ready for you that accesses that ZAP data model. And not only are we supporting the general ledger, but we also have additional reports as well. And you can see, you know, we have accounts receivable, we have procurement analytics, accounts payable, etc. So if I just go on and, you know, just search for ZAP, for example, you'll see that there's a variety of other analytics that we're providing for you.
Yeah,
so you can do that on that app source, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Rich, you know, there's quite a bit that's out there. You know, I think folks, if you do go out, you'll find that we have some recently released F&O specific ones, as we have some specific ones for some of the other ERPs as well. That's really awesome, Rich, and I just simply wish we probably had more time to kind of walk people through it. At this stage, I might just kind of take control back, if you don't mind, Rich, and let me see if I can make myself presenter again, and then we'll kind of close some things out. And as we're doing this, I think it's really important that everybody not only understand these key takeaways, but if you have questions, you know, please get them into the Q&A panel. We're, you know, certainly able to stay beyond the hour if we need to for the Q&A, but the key takeaways, you know, certainly there's plenty of options out there, you know, and some of them, you know, are possibly a little bit harder to understand than others. Hopefully we've given you a little bit of insight. As the case with all things Microsoft, Azure, and cloud, things continue to evolve. And so it's important to kind of continue to understand the direction those types of solutions go. I can tell you that we have a lot of happy customers that are using ZAP Data Hub to go against D365. That they're not a little bit less concerned about the options per se. And it's certainly something that we would be excited to talk with many of you about if you'd like. The speed of time to value, you know, hopefully Rich kind of painted a little bit of the picture there of kind of getting a model stood up and getting to a warehouse quickly is very feasible without a lot of technical complexity. So with all those things being said, you know, I'll just simply share a last screen and encourage you again to put in the questions in the Q&A. We had a number of questions that did kind of come in during the course of it. I did try to reply to some of them. One of them is, how do you connect Power BI to ZAP? So sorry, that's a really probably fundamental thing that we should cover. ZAP is storing data within an Azure SQL, or it can be your own on-prem SQL server, depending on kind of how you choose to deploy. In that way, Power BI can be doing DirectQuery against the tabular models that we can create. It can be doing direct query against the SQL database that we create, or you can do a limited amount of modeling, you know, within Power BI if you choose to do that. So thank you for that question. How does the use of Power BI Premium versus all users with Power BI Pro change in the recommendations or considerations, or that decision completely separate? That's a pretty long answer. Certainly Premium comes with an elevated price tag, which, you know, drives some different options. The most significant of which, I think for this conversation, is Premium is unlocking the volume of data that you can, you know, work with and store. But Premium doesn't necessarily, I think, enable things like the common data service. I think that still does carry some ancillary expense, but I could be wrong on that. So Does Zap store the Zap model in analysis services or just a SQL database? We actually have the options for both. So we will create a relational destination. That relational destination can be processed into a traditional analysis services cube. What it can also be is processed into a tabular model as well. Tabular models tend to be the proper underpinnings for Power BI based analytics. As a matter of fact, Power BI uses tabular under the covers when you store data on powerbi.com. Just sorry, I'm kind of bouncing around on the questions. There was a lot of good ones that were asked. Can you build DirectQuery reports using data warehouse data? Yes, you can, depending on kind of the source you connect to. Can reports be written as DirectQuery reports and embedded into D365 using OData as opposed to BYOD? Unfortunately, no. So Power BI has restrictions that do not allow for you to do DirectQuery against OData. Probably because of the fact that OData is a relatively slow source, and you can only imagine if you published a Power BI report that had direct query going on directly to OData, that would possibly bring OData interfaces on the edges of D365 applications to their knees. So what other questions? People had asked about the recording and its availability. We'll certainly send a link out after the fact. If there's a desire to get to the presentation, just write to one of us on the screen here or email info@zapbi.com. Gosh, you know, we've covered a lot of ground in essentially 60 minutes. If you do have additional questions, do reach out to us. You can visit us at zapbi.com. You've got my email there. You've got Rich's email there. We certainly encourage you to reach out. And more importantly, we hope that you'll join us on July the 8th when we do the next session in this webinar series of Microsoft Dynamics and Zap. So hope you got a lot of value out of this. Certainly appreciate all the feedback in the way of the surveys and the polls. Thank you for attending. Spread the word. We'd love to see not only yourselves, but some of your peers on the next webinar. So with that, just simply say thank you very much and have a great day, everybody.